Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we'll be listening to Exit Stage Right, Succession Planning and Exit Strategies, a session that was presented at Winter Institute 2025 in Denver, Colorado.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Stephanie Valdez. I'm the moderator of this session, and thank you for being here. Before we begin, I have a little bit of housekeeping. We have slides and handouts which are available in many different places on the app and on the ABA website. We're going to ask you at the end to fill out the session survey. That really helps the ABA staff decide what programming is valuable and important to you, and it's a key part of planning next year's conference. Recordings of this session will be on BookWeb and BookED. I'm going to ask everybody to make sure that they've silenced their cell phones. And if you have questions, please wait for the mic. Today we're very lucky to have PK Sindwani here in the back. He has a microphone for you. We'll have room for questions at the end of the session. I'm going to remind you about the antitrust guidelines that the ABA asks us to tell you at the beginning of each session. I'm sure you've had these reminded before. This session is about planning for both buying or selling a bookstore. Obviously, those things kind of go in hand, whether you're at the very beginning of thinking about selling your store or the very beginning of thinking about buying a store or very deep into the process. We're going to talk about some overviews and give you some tools in case you want to pursue this further. As I said, I'm Stephanie Valdez. I own Community Bookstore and Terrace Books in Brooklyn, New York. I bought Community Bookstore 14 years ago with a partner. Then we bought Terrace Books about 11 years ago. A few years ago, my partner decided to retire and I bought his half of the business from him. So I've been through this a couple of times. And now I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Chris McDaniel. My husband and business partner, Berkeley McDaniel's in the audience. We bought an established bookstore in our community that had been there for 20 years about 3 years ago. And it's a new and used bookstore in a special kind of shopping district in our town.
My name is Lauren Tiedemann. I am from just outside of Boston. I bought an existing store a little over 2 years ago with a business partner, and the two of us are the third set of owners of the store, and we do just new books.
My name is Chris Sluxom, and I've worked at the Raven Bookstore since 2013. I became a co-owner in 2021, and then I became a full owner in 2025. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. I also forgot to thank Ingram, our incredible lead sponsor for this event, and all of our publisher sponsors for this conference. This is our agenda today. We're going to try to keep it to 45 minutes so there's time for questions. And we'll get started. So what can you learn about succession planning from booksellers who've just bought a bookstore?
Did you want to ask?
Oh yeah, we did talk about who in this room is interested in buying a bookstore?
One in the back. I got one in the back.
Yeah. So I think I know the answer to the second question. Who's interested in selling their bookstore?
Wait a second.
Great. That helps us guide our conversation a bit over the course of the session. So a big question that came up as we were talking about the planning session is how will you handle knowledge transfer? And also, what do you want your relationship to be with the buyer? So I'll let everyone talk.
Yeah, as we panelists were talking amongst ourselves, it's very different depending on what is the buyer and seller relationship, right? So some of us here kind of were loyal customers, didn't really know the seller at the time. And so knowledge transfer was a bigger piece of the equation to us. In our case, we were never even booksellers. We just loved books, and we always kind of kicked around the idea that maybe someday when we retired from our corporate jobs, we'd own a bookstore. So we knew nothing, and we were really counting on getting a lot of knowledge transfer. So as a seller, you need to know, are you prepared for that possibility, or do you really need to target someone who knows the industry and knows your store?
In my situation, so I've worked in bookselling for about 17 years before I bought my store, same with my business partner, but we never worked at the store we purchased. We weren't actually planning to buy a store. We were planning to open our own store from scratch. It was supposed to be a 5-year plan. We heard the store that we ended up buying was up for sale, went to look at it. The next thing is history. So we actually only had about 3 days of actual knowledge transfer working at the store before we had the keys. So we did the reverse. But the owner, volunteered to be around. We kept on a lot of the staff. We bought it right before Christmas. So it was kind of just all systems go, and we learned as we went.
When I was hired in 2013, I was hired by a woman named Heidi Rock, who owns now a bookstore in Algoma, Wisconsin, called Yardstick Books and Yardstick Books and Art. And I don't know if she was grooming me to be an owner in the future, but she was just basically teaching me all the inner workings of the ordering process, the bank process. She didn't teach me a lot of the financials, but she taught me a lot of the basics financial stuff. And so, yeah, I just kind of, was working alongside her pretty much every day and kind of watching what she was doing. And she was kind of teaching me as, she would do it. And then, I think Danny Kane got hired a year or two later. And then, in 2017, when she was actually ready to sell, Danny was ready to buy. And so, Danny bought the store from her. And so that transition, was, again, she essentially gave him all of her notebooks and got all the knowledge to him that way. And, he hired me back on after he rebought the store. And, for our then transfer into, this ownership, I took an accounting for booksellers class from the booksellers education courses that we are offered. And then, also Danny just maybe a pretty, intense packet for a lot of the financial stuff, because that's seemingly, now my biggest part of my job is handling all the taxes and all the payroll and, things like that. And so, that's been the main kind of knowledge transfer for me now, because, in terms of the ordering and all that other stuff, I'd kind of already had that established in my brain, even before, I was made a part owner in 2021. And, that's essentially my experience with that.
There are also lots of questions about whether you want to sell non-tangible property, and will you, whether or not you'll agree to a non-compete clause. We won't go too much into those details because I think we have a lot to cover. Is there anything else we want to cover in terms of, thinking about being prepared to sell your bookstore?
I think, at least from my perspective, again, if you're either looking in-house to sell it to somebody that's a bookseller or a manager that you already know is capable of possibly running the store, you already feel as though they are running the store. That essentially, in my mind, might be the easiest method, but obviously that's not always going to happen for everyone, because sometimes people just don't want to do retail for the rest of their life, or they don't want to sell books, and it's very understandable. So then when you have an outside seller coming in, or outside buyer coming in, I think it is just really, really important, essentially, just to as crystal clear as possible, get all the documentation of the accounts, all the publishers, all of the reps, even these things, the different, conventions that happen, just stuff like that we take for granted. We get all these emails, and I know, sometimes they're a little overwhelming, but all the information that we're given, it is hard to transfer that over to somebody that is completely outside of the business. It's not impossible. It's been obviously very successful many times. And Heidi, I think when she bought the store in 2008, she hadn't been a bookseller before. She had done a number of different jobs she might have been a bookseller, but she wasn't a bookstore owner, I suppose I should say. But so, she definitely, I think, had to learn kind of on the fly. But then also, again, one of our former owners that started the store in 1987 still worked at the store until 2015. So I think she was also kind of along for the ride to give her the information that she needed and stuff.
Okay.
I think it's really important as a seller for you to think about what you need out of the sale. Do you need to be made whole financially? Do you need to ensure the legacy or the mission of your store? Do you need to know the people that are taking it on and trust them? Or are you comfortable going out to a broker situation? I think these are the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself. And this isn't unlike, my husband and I sold our home recently, and the people that bought our home, we were really glad to know that they were environmentalists because we'd had a lot of like gardens and things. Similarly, like if you have a mission-driven store and you care a lot about that mission, you may care more that the people who are buying understand and will carry on your mission and your legacy, more than or as much as the financial transaction too. So, you have to do a little soul searching if you're a seller to really think about what will make you feel good at the end of this transaction.
So, finding a support system is a big part of making this transition. Does anyone want to talk about their support team? Both personally, legally and financially, but also, sort of beyond the bounds of those obvious checkboxes.
So I am very risk averse, and the idea of buying a business was very scary. So from the beginning, we hired an amazing lawyer and accountant, and we spent a lot of time meeting with them. Spent a lot of time on the phone with banks. We spent a lot of time at the library doing research and writing a business plan. How do you get a small business loan? We really relied on our network for that. So I was a Barnes & Noble bookseller, so I was not in the indie world, so I didn't know sort of all the resources the ABA had, so I didn't use that. I should have reached out to other indie bookstore owners if I'd thought of it, but again, it all happened too quickly. But yeah, for us, just having everything, like all the, dot the I's and cross the T's, just make sure we all knew exactly what was included in the sale and who was responsible for what was very important to us.
Yeah, definitely still reaching out to a lot of bookstore owner friends that I've made in these conventions over the years and, just asking for their advice on things. Danny is still very much, a person of support. Also, just like Lawrence kind of has like a Stars Hollow vibe where it's like real like small town kind of like basically like Mass Street is like, everything kind of happens on Mass Street. And so if I like need advice on something, I can walk across the street to the record store that's been there since like, for over 40 years and ask them some advice. Or we have a print shop or a plant store. There's just a number of places that like, and Danny also did this. So that's kind of where I took the, the knowledge of just being like, oh, I need to like have like not just like bookstore like owner friends, but also just like small business store owner friends. And then, also like our accountant, she's like super chill, which really helps me because I can be real chill, but I can also be real uptight. And so when I'm like nervous about something, she's just like, oh, it's fine. And I'm like, okay, I feel if you say it's fine, I feel it's fine. So it's all good. And so that's really helpful. But yeah, and again, and we just have like a pretty incredible staff too. And so everybody like on staff is like able to kind of hold their own in their own realms and stuff. So it's nice to like know that we can rely on them to do things. And, I'm like helping with events, but I'm not running a lot of the events just because I don't have the capacity in my like time in my life to, work 8 to 5 and then another like 7 to 10 shift or whatever. So it's just a lot of that kind of stuff too, where you have like that support system. You just make sure you like utilize it and you're not just an island.
I will just chime in to add one more thing for us, especially right after buying the store. Being very involved with the Chamber of Commerce has been really, really helpful. We're lucky we have an awesome chamber. But again, I was a corporate store manager for ages, and I just didn't realize how many things home office did for us. So having somebody to go to say, legally, what can I do here? What should I do? Has been wonderful.
Yeah, I'll underscore the value of a lawyer that you trust and aren't worried about how much time you spend with them. Uncovering all the, the nuances of leases and non-competes and transfer of assets and like all those details. I don't know about y'all, but I haven't ever done this before. And so having someone who knew the ropes and knew the ins and outs and what questions to ask was really helpful. We also had a really good accountant who helped us with the valuation. And, I said a million times during the process, will this business pay for itself? And how will I know if this business can pay for itself? And that accountant that we used was really helpful in, structuring our due diligence, helping us find ways that we could do the due diligence ourselves without having to, not have any money to buy a business because we paid him so much. He was really good about teaching us what we could do ourselves. So finding people like that will help you help yourself and that you trust is really huge. And then I would say just be curious in this process. Ask everyone you can think of. Ask everyone you know. Ask people you don't know who own small businesses. What am I forgetting? What don't I know? What should I think about? Because there are a million things, and I don't want to scare you because, out of the million things, we probably missed most of them in our purchase, and we're still doing okay. And places like this are places that you can learn and pick up those pieces later. But there's a million things, and wow. Some of them I really wish I had known before. Some of them we're recouping now and gaining an understanding of. But just be curious through this whole process. What am I forgetting? What do I need to know? What's important? What do you wish you'd done differently?
And I think using that to structure your support team, if you're very strong in terms of legal or finance, maybe you need other aspects, or maybe you know that your relationship with your lawyer hasn't been that great the last couple of years, and maybe you need to ask around and find someone new. I think getting that team in place early in the process really helps. And I think figuring out, how to really build and support your support team. Also, you can use a lot of the resources that the ABA has to educate your support team. I think PK brought up a great point before the session that oftentimes banks, lawyers, and accountants don't really understand how our business works and the unique challenges of things like valuation. Most of our inventory is returnable, and that's a very unique place to be in the sort of financial realm. So there are some unique things to bookstores. I think also in terms of succession approaches, sometimes you're really going for a mission-driven ownership transfer, or sometimes you really need to make it affordable for somebody in your store to buy the store instead of looking for a sort of highest bidder price. So I think find a team that supports the mission that you're after. For instance, if it is much more mission-driven, you can find legal and accounting support that maybe is more used to working with nonprofits in your community or other mission-driven businesses. And I think that can help you get the outcome that you're looking for. Preparing for unexpected challenges. So some of this we discussed a little bit, but potential messy situations to get ahead of. And I think, Chris, you talked a little bit about how we have two Chris's on this panel. Chris McDaniel. You talked a little bit about how owners can prepare to how you can prepare to sell your business and how you can make sure that these numbers really make sense.
Yeah, sure. And like I said a minute ago, I asked myself a million times as a buyer, how do I know this business is going to pay for itself? So as a seller, be prepared to make the case that your business can pay for itself, right? And as you set the price, make sure that that's clear. There's some things you can do to support that. One is you can make sure that your financials are solid and that you have optimized your cash flow, because that, I promise, the cash flow is what people are going to look at to see, can this business pay for itself? So if you're preparing a year or 2 or 3 ahead of time, work on your cash flow, optimize it, make sure you're doing everything you can to make that look really good. Some other things you can do is, I wanted to know, and I was sorely disappointed in this, but we bought our business out of COVID and we kind of lost the whole staff. And the owner of our store actually ran it out of his head in scraps of paper. So this was not an ideal situation for us. But let me tell you, if I was buying a business again, I would really want it to be turnkey. And what I mean by that is I would want the staff to have been developed, to have had knowledge share of how this business runs, so that the new owner can learn from them what to do, what's important, right? So if you haven't already trained and developed your staff to that point, that's something you can work on in the time leading up to your sale. Also, documentation, because staff might have to leave before your sale is complete, right? So do work on the training and development of your staff, but also document your processes and procedures so that you can show the buyer it's all here. It's all in the notebook. We have processes for everything. You'll figure it out. And if you don't, you'll have something, right? That would be a big comfort to me as a buyer. About cash flow. Sorry, one more quick thing. There was a great session on how to optimize your cash flow at the start of this conference. And if you didn't get to attend it, I encourage you, if you're selling your business, to go back and replay that session. It was really good.
One thing we did right before we bought the store is we conducted an inventory with my business partner and I and some of the current staff. And that way we all were on the same page of exactly what was in the building. And then we came up with a price that was a little bit discounted than the value, knowing that we didn't pick these books. There might be some things we don't want. And they'd sat on the shelf. They were not, fresh out of the box from the publisher. And then in terms of staffing, one thing I would say, if you're thinking of selling, be open and honest with your staff. Our staff that we inherited knew the bookstore was for sale, but didn't know that they'd found an owner until we showed up 3 days before. So that was challenging. They knew it was for sale, but they didn't know that the process was that far along. So they were a little shocked when we showed up.
We're still working out our new lease, actually. Danny's still technically on the lease, but I think our lease expires at the end of this month, or March rather. And so that is one thing that we didn't bring our landlord in the conversation, which they were a little put off by that, which is fair. And so we're essentially, it's basically the same lease. I think they just are including a clause that if we sell the store, we need to make sure we bring them in the conversation, which again, I understand. I agree with that. I'll sign to that. But otherwise, we need to conduct an inventory. We're actually well overdue for one. We should have done one last year. And so it's kind of, that process is still being figured out too. But thankfully I have a co-owner who is really on top of running at least the inventory numbers and reports at the end of the month. And it doesn't always obviously match up to the exact stuff on the shelf, but I think it's at least given us a estimation of a close enough and stuff like that. So that's kind of one thing that we're still figuring out. But yeah, as Chris said, is just documentation just as much as possible. And then again, a coherent system of the documents, and also just, whether it's by month or by quarter or however it makes sense to you, try to make sense to them as well. I said this earlier as well. And one thing that my accountant again says a lot to me is that essentially I just need to find what works for myself. I'm still trying to fit into my accounting into Danny's mold, and Danny and I think very differently. And so once I fully accepted that helped me a lot too. And obviously his information, everything still is really helpful. But just, kind of that confidence that I was able to allot myself as okay, I can do this. I just need to make sure I'm doing it my way. And that helped me a lot. So
I definitely advocate for bringing your landlord into the process. You don't need to tell them you're thinking about selling, but as soon as your store is on the market, you don't want them to hear it from another party. Oftentimes leases are personally guaranteed. And also they often have the ability to, depends on what your lease is like, they have the ability to sort of change the terms or require a bigger deposit, or things. You could hit some unexpected snags late in the buying process if you don't have your landlord on board. Also, often people love to be the first in the town to know. So if you bring them in, they'll feel like a stakeholder in the process, and usually they want to keep the store in place. So showing that you're making a good faith effort to work with them can make the whole process run much more smoothly.
I'm going to talk about taxes and gift cards.
Sure, we can talk about taxes, gift cards, store credits. I think so much of this is case by case, but maybe we should talk about taxes.
I just want to say, I think most of us are going to care about the success of our successor. One thing I'll just tell you, even after having been in corporate America for a very long time, the taxes just blew me away. And I didn't have a full picture. In spite of all my due diligence, I didn't have a full picture of taxes. And when I say taxes, I made a list so I wouldn't forget. When I say taxes, you want to make sure your buyer is aware of sales tax, payroll tax, income tax, personal property tax, real estate tax. As a seller, you may take all of that for granted, but as a buyer, I did not. And that's a huge chunk of our expenses each year that I didn't account for in can this business pay for itself? So, we're okay. I don't want anybody to worry about us, but if you care about the success of your successor, please make sure they understand that tax isn't just one or two of those categories. Make sure they understand the full picture. The other thing you should understand as a seller is that next bullet on our list is gift cards, credit, etc. That's a liability for the purchaser, and it's something that you will need to be prepared to account for in the sale. So in our situation, we set a selling price and the owner gave us the full value of outstanding gift cards and credit as credit on our purchase price. So that's it, because it was big. It was really big. So just be aware of that. It's something you're going to want to be aware of when you set your price. And that messy question at the top is what's included in the price. That one could sway it pretty substantially.
And I'll say for gift cards, it was a little different. They gave us, we put 50%, or the seller put 50% of the outstanding value in an escrow account. And quarterly for 2 years, we had to submit how many of those gift cards were redeemed, and we received a check. And after 2 years, anything left in the escrow went back to the seller. So we now are responsible for those, or not, but we're choosing to honor them.
Yeah, and our gift cards just rolled over. I think, again, it's because we just kind of have a different process where it's the same bookstore people are still running the bookstore. We just kind of considered our duty to fulfill those gift cards and stuff like that. So it wasn't really figured into our value. But again, the inventory and all that stuff were. So
I guess we should say too, there are a few different ways to run the sale. So for us, my business partner and I started our own LLC and bought all of the physical assets and sort of the customer base within the store, but are totally a separate company, technically and legally. So we're not responsible for any unpaid taxes, anything outstanding, if there was any legal action, none of that falls on us.
Yeah, and we did we bought the LLC, and it's seller finance and stuff too. So we're paying Danny over a series of years, which is obviously very generous. There's something that you said that I was going to make a point about too that I forget now. I'll come back to it if I think about it. But yeah, I'm kind of like a unicorn example, I think, because we're just have a nice situation going on with our stuff. So.
Did you have the same situation where did you also create your own LLC and man
Yes, we did an asset purchase. As I mentioned, our previous, our predecessor, the man that sold us the business, ran it on scraps of paper and out of his head. And so we had no way of investigating what liabilities might be out there. And we had no interest in discovering them later. So we absolutely did an asset purchase.
An asset purchase tends to be the most common way that this is handled. But then there are always exceptions. In my case, it was an asset purchase both times. And then I purchased 50% of the business from my business partner as well. So that was sort of just like an ownership transfer within an LLC. In both cases, my businesses were asset purchases, but then later, when my business partner retired, I purchased his ownership percentage.
Can you just be more specific about what's the difference between an asset purchase and whatever other kind of
Sure. The difference is that legally you're creating a new entity. So let's say it's an LLC. You're creating your own LLC and you're agreeing that you're purchasing a specific set of assets, usually things like fixtures, inventory, but you're not assuming or absorbing any of the risk of the business that preceded you. That's the typical way, most commonly for small businesses, that's the way that people buy new stores, only because you don't know what unpaid taxes they have. You don't know what kind of legal liabilities they have. You don't know what kind of bills they might owe. So, but there are cases, especially with often larger entities, where it makes sense for a company to be purchased in whole. And then you'd be assuming all of the assets and the liabilities of the previous entity.
So from the seller's point of view, in the case of the asset purchase, then do all those potential liabilities and debts and whatever remain the legal responsibility of the seller
They do.
beyond the point of the sale?
Correct.
Can I add something on taxes?
Of course, please.
Okay. Taxes is I see most of the people are here to sell instead of buy. So taxes is a big part of the conversation. It's a big surprise. So the way you structure sale is whether you're buying fixtures or goodwill or inventory. So if your assets are all depreciated, but on the sale it says, well, I'm paying $100,000 for fixtures, that means on that $100,000 you pay short-term gain. On the goodwill part, you pay long-term gain tax, which is half of the short-term gain loss. So how you structure the deal is also important as a seller. Big thing I learned afterwards.
And I'm sure PK will be available for questions if you have questions for him as well.
But these are the reasons you need a good friend in your attorney and your accountant.
Yes, so the same thing. My landlord rejected my first owner. So that was the other thing I wanted to say, because in my lease, they said, well, you cannot sell the store unless they approve the tenant, because they have just as much stake in it. So if you have an asset sale, make sure all the liability goes to the new buyer.
We can take one more question. Yeah.
So I'm in an interesting situation. I'm the potential buyer, and our bookstore is a partnership. So my plan was to establish an LLC. They were going to dissolve their partnership, and then I would take over somehow. But I don't know if any of you have experience with partnerships.
Kind
PK.
It should work the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was gonna say from ours too, like, because we established like a holding company in 2021. We're still kind of like with our lawyer essentially figuring out like the contract that we agreed to in 2021, like that gets absorbed into this new contract that we signed at the end of 2024, right? So it can definitely be done, and I think it's just like essentially a document, essentially saying that that's what's happening, and then getting it like notarized and getting it with like a lawyer. That way, it's like all legal, And I'm sure there's with like the different publishers and stuff too. Like if they already have like an LLC that they use for their partnership, you will just have to like reestablish accounts. However, a lot of times too, they are willing to like, I think certain ones are either forgetful or also just like willing to like roll over the old account, you know what I mean? To kind of keep the same account number at least. Because again, when Danny bought the store from Heidi, I didn't really notice like much account change, but I do know that like the LLC changed. And so there must have been some kind of like workings that I was just like oblivious to at that time. But now, it took us like, for some accounts, it got set up within a week. And then some, like, we're still in the process of like back and forth, like, just getting all the documents to everybody and stuff like that. So, yeah.
And I think PK brought up an important point before the session, which was that a lot of times, whether it's opening a vendor account or working with your landlord, those parties will probably evaluate your buyer on a personal level and not necessarily won't always take into account their expertise, their fitness to take over the business. So it is a little bit of a dance in terms of preparing the person who wants to buy the store that they are going to be personally sort of vetted for this process. The landlord may want to meet with them. The the account forms will all have to be initially under their name, especially without references in the book business. You have to sort of start from scratch, even if it's an existing business. Not with every publisher, but for most publishers. So these are things to take into account as you're sort of like determining your successor. Does anyone have experience? Did anyone have the seller signed an NDA?
We did, and it was actually the seller's idea to sign one. And we did that. They had us sign it very early on. They had they listed the store was for sale and shelf awareness, and then we reached out to learn more. They sent us like a quick kind of one pager, and from there they said, if you want to see more, we'll have you sign an NDA.
Did you sign that?
We did not. I kind of wish we had.
Danny lives in Cleveland, so if he ran a bookstore in Cleveland, that'd be fine. So. I don't know about the other Cleveland bookstores, but
We talked a bit about inventory before, but understanding your inventory, obviously, it's most of the assets in your store. We talked a little bit about you could have the buyer run an inventory to really get on the same page. I think this point about the used book market being very different, it is a very different business in terms of valuation. The book value is much more variable. But understanding your inventory is a big chunk of, and hopefully getting your inventory into really great shape, making sure that you've kind of like cleaned house a bit and that your inventory is it's very clear, very obvious. You have messy corners. It's a great time to clean them up before you are thinking about selling.
One thing I'll say too is, so again, we bought an existing store. We ended up buying it November 1st, which meant holiday orders were, well placed and coming. So that was something I, as this buyer, was very anxious about, like what bills were about to arrive on our doorstep. So again, just being really clear, teaching your buyer about Edelweiss and how to see your orders, introduce them to your reps, let them know, if they need to cancel things, edit things, how they can do that, and what sort of the timeline for that is.
This isn't on this sheet, but a messy situation that could come up is it fell under the category in our contract called work in progress. And work in progress could mean an event you've agreed to that's not going to take place until after the sale. It could mean a special order you've placed that's not going to get fulfilled, a pre-order that's not going to get fulfilled. Think about things that sort of will span the before and after, and make sure you're thinking hard about how are you going to handle that and who's responsible for what, and spelling that out.
So what will buyers want to see from you? 5 years of sales and P&L statements. Those are pretty standard. I think they may want to see a lot more financial documents. They might want to see, more like monthly cash flow statements. You can choose to do something like an NDA before you even kind of show them anything financially about the business. Did anyone else, was there any other kind of document that you feel like you should warn people about?
I think with the P&L, again, like I said, very risk averse here. We asked them to show us everything from the 06, I think from 06 on. They'd had it since 92. And we wanted to see how it weathered the last recession.
And we'd been, for like the last at least maybe 4 years or 5 years, whenever we get like the abacus back and stuff, like we'd have a conversation kind of about like all the information with the abacus. And that was always really helpful for my own just kind of understanding of the store and like, all the little nitty gritty details of like what we can do in our space and everything like that. So that was really helpful. And then again, like, been on the floor, like selling books and like seeing the daily sales and the, weekly sales for 13 years. So I knew that it would be a viable business for sure.
I guess with the P&L too, we asked for a breakdown by category for the last 3 years just to see what sections were selling well, which ones weren't, what the turn rate was, percentage of inventory.
I asked for everything. I didn't just ask for the P&L. I asked for the P&Ls. I asked for the balance sheets. I asked for the cash flows, which didn't exist. But for the P&Ls, I asked for the bank statements. And I refused to buy the business until I could prove that the P&Ls tied. They weren't perfect. They're not going to be perfect in my business either. But I wanted to see that roughly what was coming in was what was advertised on the P&Ls. That was really important to me. And that was part of my due diligence is I literally combed the bank statements and made sure that what was coming in and going out in the categories matched, and where they didn't, I asked questions.
I think someone mentioned Abacus, and I think that's a great tool, whether you need to, sort of educate your team, your financial professionals around you, your lawyer, just to show them, yes, we're kind of in line with industry standards on certain things, or we're beating expectations. It's a great way. I think also it's a great tool to be able to show a potential buyer, 5 years of Abacus or something like that. So if you're not doing Abacus now, it's a great time to start as you think about the process. I'm going to have people hold questions until the end because we're very close to our question time. Any quick advice on hiring a lawyer?
I mean, I used my parents' lawyer because we had a relationship with him already and he seemed great.
Yeah, I used someone I'd already had a relationship with also.
Yeah, same. It was kind of like the store lawyer, and we had to sign like that it was okay for him to like negotiate both sides, but it was fine because again, it all worked out and we were all on the same like level and nothing was nefarious behind the scenes, thankfully.
I will say there are a lot of small business resources in New York City. I recently used a small business program for free legal help to review a lease, which I needed in kind of a quick turnaround. And sometimes it's worth just like exploring what options are available. Exploring non-traditional succession approaches. That's something I'm actually really passionate in this business. I think there's no single way to buy or sell a bookstore. There's seller finance, there's community financing, there's running the bookstore with the new owner for a year and structuring a sale to key employees. My business partner and I bought a failing bookstore, and so we sort of worked with the owner over the course of the year while we were running the bookstore to make the sale happen. She sort of had abandoned it to some employees, and so we stepped in and sort of stabilized the business and figured out what the business was worth and then bought the business. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and I encourage you to think about what will make your business, especially if it's something you've spent your career building, what will put this business and will put this bookstore in good hands. I know you, Chris, you were also in kind of a non-traditional succession approach. Do you want to break that down for a minute?
Yeah, definitely. And as I said earlier, it's seller finance, right? So Danny, essentially we're just like paying off like a note that our lawyer wrote up essentially. And then it's also, I say, like structured sale to key employees as well. And the 2021 like ownership, it's like, I don't know all like the nitty gritty, I guess, but there was like 7 owners at that point. Right. And so that was fine. And like, definitely there was a nice, like really good team, but there was kind of a bit of like, it was kind of like a team of rivals, but there wasn't a lot of progress happening at certain times because there was just more like kind of different viewpoints that were having difficulty like aligning. So I do think like, the simpler you can make like the sale, the better in a lot of ways. But also, yeah, it's just, essentially, like a lot of that kind of worked itself out, which is either people got like other jobs and they like moved on, or other things just like occurred like kind of naturally. But yeah, it's definitely been non-traditional, and like I said earlier, like kind of like a unicorn example, just because obviously Danny's like a very big advocate for bookstores, and so he's not trying to capitalize on us, beyond like what he knows like we're capable of doing and making like actually like happen, and so that was obviously very nice. And again, we live in a pretty small community that, if I have an issue with my landlord, I could just text him and if he's not snowboarding, he'll text me back or something, so it's just kind of like, again, like very lucky in lots of ways to have kind of fallen into this realm. But yeah, thankfully, like with the structured sale to key employees, I think that's, if you have that on your staff and you have people that seem like they really, really want to like run a bookstore, I say like cultivate that like as much as possible. I just think that just makes the most logical sense. The sale that happened in 2008 when Heidi bought the store, before Heidi bought the store, there was like another bookseller who actually is now an owner as well as with me, who's worked there since 1997, who was considering buying the store with like another customer, basically, because the customer didn't want the store to go away. They'd already beaten Borders, which was nice. And Borders literally like opened up across the street and from the original Raven. And they, left, we stayed. And so there was just like this kind of like community like rallying that was just like, if ever things happen, I think the community would just like really rally behind us. And it is just really nice to have that support system for sure. So, yeah.
I'll just mention too, going back to the many wonderful resources that the ABA provides, there was a great panel on succession planning at Winter Institute in 2023 where several people really gave some good detail about different possible structures, including David Sandberg, who's sitting in the room here and has the approach that I most admire. You have the ability to go on BookWeb, and watch that session, which might give you some good ideas about different potential structures.
And I'll just chime in quickly for those thinking of buying a bookstore. You don't have to have a ton of money saved up to do it. There are many ways to do it. As Chris was saying earlier, as a seller, thinking about what your mission is and what your goals are, we're very lucky that our sellers, her main goal was keep the bookstore going, keep the legacy going. So structured it such that we paid a portion when we took the keys. We paid another portion, I think February 1st, and then the balance March 1st. So that way we used the holiday sales to help pay it down. And we took out just a standard 7-year loan to, have cash flow.
I was going to say too, really quickly, that also when Danny bought the store from Heidi in 2017, that was also seller financed. And so there was already kind of like the precedent. And because of that, like we knew that it was possible to do this and do it successfully and make it like, amicable between all parties. And it just was going to work out again because like I said, we had a pre-existing relationship.
Great. I think it's time for us to move on to questions. Well, I should say first, there's joy in this transition. So this is a great way to ensure your legacy as a seller and to find, and as a buyer, it's an exciting way to like continue to build a bookstore in the community. Questions, please make sure to wait for a mic. We have PK walking around with one. This allows the people who are listening to the recording to hear your questions.
There's one in the corner. I'm not sure if you can see past the pillar.
Who's going first, mate? Okay. Can I don't know whether anybody has an answer to this, but, unless I come up with one myself, but can I have some thoughts around the amount of time of years of P&Ls and balance sheets and all that you would give somebody, which of course we've talked about 5 years. How would you suggest you incorporate COVID into that?
I'll answer that because we bought our store out of COVID. And so for us, of course, the owner didn't have great records. But we wanted to go back and see his numbers before COVID, right? So we bought our store in 2021 and we only got 3 years worth of data. We got 2018, 2019, and 2020. And he thought that he was going to sell his business fast enough that he didn't need to keep records in 2021.
Sorry. Hi. I'm wondering how you use previous years' income as a factor in valuing your business, and also how you use intangibles to affect the value of your business in terms of the sale price.
I should say none of us are professionals at valuation. So I think maybe PK has some guidance on that part.
When you say intangibles, what do you mean? Okay. Yeah, so that's all price, that's goodwill. So there are many ways to evaluate that business, and it's on website, but feel free to email me if you need specific questions because that's a whole session.
But just a rough rule of thumb, 3 years of net owner benefit. Somewhere between 2 and 3 years of net owner benefit. So whatever you're paying yourself and whatever the profit you could take from the business is. So that's why I said get your cash flow in order.
Hi, could you clarify the difference between a seller financed and a structural employee transition?
Well,
you go first.
I mean, I think the difference is just, someone who already works in the business versus someone from outside. You want to know the differences?
Yeah, I guess the employee transition would be like a slow burn payout.
It doesn't have to. The question was, does an employee transition have to be a slow burn transition? It doesn't have to be. It can be on January 1st, this person is now an owner of the business. But the difference, I think the difference can be a lot of things. I've known people who've worked in bookstores for many years who've moved to a different community and bought a bookstore that was either community finance or seller financed. So it's not quite, it's not an employee transition. The difference with having an employee transition is you know that person, you have a relationship, you know the ups and downs, you know probably what challenges they're going to have or what their weak spots are. Does that answer your question?
I guess so, but the seller finance version could still be given to
Yeah,
it could. Yeah, it can be seller finance to a current employee. Seller finance can be to anybody.
Right. I was just saying I probably convoluted like the question, just because like I am like a structured employee that's being seller financed essentially. So it is. I don't think it's like an either or situation, but it can be. Because I think, obviously if a employee has like the ability to buy outright or anything like that, and then, that might be better. But also if it works better for the, as like Lauren said, like you don't have a lot of money to begin with, but you can like pay off the business over time. That's essentially like what we've gotten figured out for ourselves.
And certainly there are cases where people, give a staff member a percentage of ownership that increases over time, and eventually they assume the business. Mm-hmm. Although that sounds complicated.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for all this great information. I don't want to sell my bookstore, but I think ultimately I am going to die. And and you can bury me beneath the floorboards. I'd love to be buried beneath my bookstore. But so I'm thinking like a 10-year plan. And, so at what point do you start talking about it? Because I don't want to start too early. And then especially in a small town, rumors. And so if you had like the ideal transfer of power, like what would be the timeline and what would it look like?
I was going to say earlier, PK kind of mentioned that it took like 3 years for him to sell his business and be fully like disconnected from it. I would say like that's, that would be nice. And I would say our sale took place over maybe 8 months. And again, it kind of already been talked about, and there had already been like some ownership, like given to it or, like brought into it, the situation. But I don't think 8 months was really long enough. And I also think that, again, just kind of the stuff I said earlier with like the finance, I wish that like Danny and I had some like side by side time, like where we were just like literally like going through like QuickBooks or spreadsheets and just like discussing like specifics about that kind of stuff. Because even today, like I was like running payroll and I like did something and like, his instructions to me is like 5 instructions and like it just didn't do what it needed to do. And I kept going back and doing it. And I was just like, okay. And then by the 5th time, it just worked for some reason. So, I don't know, but I think that, yeah, like if it had been possible for him to maybe work with us for another 6 months, in the store, that would have been really helpful for my own sake. But he's very like reliable and very responsive if I have any questions. And so it's not like I'm completely alone in it, which is nice. But I do think like, 2 to 3 years of like actual like transitioning would be helpful for especially the new people.
I'll say, so my experience was a little different. I do think our seller was thinking to sell right before COVID, and then COVID hit and decided she couldn't sell. But from when she listed it for sale, was June, and we fully signed everything by mid-September and then took over in November. And I think for us, that was a perfect timeline. I think it was helpful that she was around to answer questions, but we kind of wanted to be able to make it ours and not have her there all the time, I think. She made it very clear she's happy to answer questions, happy to come in. But there was times at the beginning she was there almost too much. And we didn't say anything, but we sort of were like, at what point do we say, it's ours now? Like, it's your baby, we know, but...
Julie, I don't know if a sale to your employees is in the cards, but it's funny that you said 10 years. And I'm going to go back to something I said a minute ago, which was the 2023 session on succession planning and Mr. David Sandberg in the corner of Porter Square Books, because that's exactly the time frame that he structured his sale with. 50% out of profits to existing employees for the first 5 years while he's there. And then he steps out and they continue to buy the other 50% over the next 5 years. And it's, to me, it's a really genius plan. I don't mean to like be David's plug person, but hype person, but I think that's a really smart plan. And what I love about it is that it incentivizes the current employees to maximize profit for the store. So, because they've got a stake in it, like, they're not just there collecting their hourly or salaried wage. They're there trying to make the store better.
I'm in a situation where the original founder of the store passed on the business to 4 staff and it was gifted. And the new owner is kind of wanting to do that as well. And I'm just unsure in terms of, she suggested like having the same lawyer and kind of reaching out, and the timeline has been increased where she wants to bring a couple of us along sooner and then step out of the business in say like 3 to 5 years. And it sounds like that might be more similar to what Raven Bookstore has done. And I'm just like, I've been the manager for a while and I've worked in the store for 17 years, but I'm just not even sure how to wrap my brain around who I need to talk to an accountant, to a lawyer, and what that looks like in terms of like, we would be working together for a transition for quite a while, and we already work. She's the owner, I'm the manager. But it's hard to even wrap your brain around such an idea, and on a kind of quicker timeline than I had originally been expecting.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest probably using like the same lawyer that, especially for the first transition, because if they've already got the framework and at least like the mindset to be able to achieve that kind of document, I think that's really helpful. So you don't have to like explain to them like your ethos or just like why this bookstore is doing this, you know? And yeah, we talked about this like in the 2021 time too, just because like, you know, businesses just aren't like structured this way ever. You know, there's like very few businesses that are either like gifted or there's like some benevolent owner that is able to like finance something like in a way that's manageable for the people. Maybe I'm just being a little negative there, but you know what I'm saying? So I definitely think like the same lawyer is like pretty crucial. And also definitely like an accountant when like, if you have like an accountant for the store right now, it wouldn't hurt if you don't, getting one to kind of like start the process of looking at all the old books and getting like ready for the new ones as well. That would definitely be helpful for the transition. But yeah, I do think it's possible for sure. And I mean, obviously it's already been possible. You guys have done it once. So I think if you have that lawyer, and, you know, it wouldn't hurt obviously to have another lawyer just take a look at things, just because I think other viewpoints are good sometimes to just like bring in that way if they miss something or if there's like a blind spot that they're not thinking about because of, you know, the time. I don't know when the first transition happened, but obviously times change pretty quickly for a lot of these things. And so I just think that there might be different things on the books that they might need to know or on the laws that they might need to know. So.
And again, check for free and local resources too. Yeah. Sometimes there's a chamber of commerce that has like a volunteer, you know, accounting or legal advice hotline, or, you know, there are a lot of different options too. If you just want somebody to kind of give you a second opinion without spending $500. I think we have time for one more.
Me? This is likely a legal question, but I'm wondering if anyone has any experience in if there is a seller financed transaction and you're a year or so into the payout and the buyer suddenly balks and says, no, this isn't for me. Is the seller then back on the hook?
Yeah. In our situation, like if we like fail to pay Danny, or if we decide we can't run the business anymore, he essentially like assumes control of the business again. And I don't think he wants that, and we don't want that either. So that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But obviously if there were like some really weird situations that went down, it would at least be back in hands that are capable in our sense, and he would, make it work, I'm sure. So it like that. It was put in a clause in our situation where, if that were ever to, I think our lawyer missed that on the first pass. And then when we did another pass, we were like, oh yeah, that should be included just because he needs to have some protection as well on his end, which is completely fair.
I'll say for us, we didn't quite do that, but there is a clause in it that I forget if it's 3 years or 5 years, but if we decided this is too much and we try to sell again, the previous owner has the right of first refusal.
Nice.
Great. Well, I think that's all of our time. There are a lot of resources. If you want to pursue this further, BookWeb has everything you need. You can contact us as well. Our contact information is on that information. And please rate this session. It really helps the team evaluate what's important to you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!